Marriages fall apart all the time, but how bad does your relationship have to be before you decide, you know what, I'm just going to go to war on their ass? Literally. That's exactly what Isabella of France did when her husband, Edward II of England, pushed her too far. And while most of us just settle for a dramatic breakup text, Isabella launched an invasion. This 14th century queen wasn't about to be disrespected. When her husband treated her like an afterthought, or more accurately, like an unwanted third wheel in his love life, she decided to flip the script. That ruthless take-no-prisoners attitude earned her the nickname the She-Wolf of France, and honestly, she lived up to it. Isabella was born into French royalty, the daughter of Philip IV, who was so ridiculously good-looking that they literally called him Philip the Fair. At just 12 years old, she was married off to Edward II of England, who was twice her age. That was already a rough start, but it got worse fast. You see, Edward wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for his young bride. Why? Because his heart, and probably his bed, was already occupied by a man named Piers Gaveston. The moment Edward and Isabella arrived in England, Piers was waiting at the docks like an eager spouse, and Edward basically threw himself into Piers's arms, ignoring his actual wife and everyone else. Things only got more humiliating from there. At their coronation, Piers strutted in wearing royal purple drenched in pearls like he was the real queen. Edward even ditched his French in-law's coat of arms in favour of Piers's, a royal slap in the face to Isabella's powerful family. Isabella was a literal teenager in a foreign country where her husband openly prioritised his bestie over her. But instead of just sulking, she did what every daddy's girl would do and complained to her father. Only then did things begin to improve. Isabella even formed an uneasy alliance with Piers, and the two of them supported Edward in his tussles with the barons as the country moved closer towards civil war. Despite Isabella's attempts to work with her husband's special friend, the English nobility weren't having it. They saw Piers as a dangerous, arrogant leech and forced Edward to exile him. However, Edward was still gonna Edward. Piers was allowed to return to England and, quelle surprise, the barons got really mad. So Edward opted for a grown-up solution, going on the run with Piers and Isabella. Unsurprisingly, this did not end well. Piers was captured by his enemies and quickly executed without a proper trial, leaving Edward devastated. With Piers out the picture, though, Edward started treating Isabella better, and their marriage actually flourished. In fact, the couple were reportedly late for a meeting because they'd been up all night having sex. Edward even had a rare heroic moment when he saved Isabella from a fire and carried her naked into the street. It was peak medieval action movie energy. The fire occurred during a trip to France, when Isabella accidentally ignited one of the biggest sex scandals of the Middle Ages, the infamous Tour de Nesle affair. Isabella had gifted her sisters-in-law some fancy purses. A few months later, she spotted two knights carrying those exact same purses. Suspicious? Absolutely. She immediately concluded that the only possible explanation was royal adultery. And it turns out she was right. Isabella's sisters-in-law, Blanche, wife of the future Louis X, and Margaret, wife of the future Charles IV, had been secretly hooking up with these knights in a guard tower called the Tour de Nesle. Joan, wife of the future Philip V, wasn't actively involved in any nookie, but apparently knew all about these saucy shenanigans and didn't tell on her girls. Isabella ran straight to her father, Philip IV, who went full FBI mode, having the knights followed, gathering evidence, and eventually just arresting everyone involved. And then, well, things got medieval. The knights were tortured into confessing and then brutally executed, as in castrated, possibly flayed alive, and then hanged. Philip IV did not play around. The guilty princesses were tossed into prison. But Isabella didn't escape the backlash. People accused her of putting bros before hoes and even suggesting she orchestrated the whole thing as a power move to place her own son on the French throne. Whether that's true or not, her reputation took a hit and the she-wolf of France narrative began. Back in England, Edward was still being a disaster. His reign was a mess, his military campaigns were failing, and worst of all, he had a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Unlike Piers, who was mostly just annoying, Hugh was straight up evil. He and his equally awful father used their influence to steal land, destroy rivals, and generally terrorise everyone. Isabella couldn't even tolerate Hugh. She hated him. And she wasn't the only one. A nobleman named Roger Mortimer also despised Hugh, and this mutual loathing would change history. Because when Isabella finally decided she'd had enough, she didn't just leave Edward, she overthrew him. Edward and the Despensers ruled brutally, confiscating lands and executing people left, right and centre. Even Isabella, the actual queen, wasn't safe. Edward stripped her of her lands, locked up her French staff, and even snatched her children away to be raised under the Despensers' watchful eyes. As if that wasn't bad enough, Edward then picked a fight with her brother, Charles IV of France. Talk about adding insult to injury. But Isabella wasn't the type to sit quietly and take it. She'd spent years standing by her husband despite his blatant favouritism, but this was too much. When Edward refused to pay proper homage to the French king and sent their son instead, Isabella saw her chance. She was already in France negotiating a truce, and now with the heir to the English throne by her side, she had the leverage she needed. Her message to Edward was simple: ditch the Despensers or she wasn't coming back. Edward, being Edward, chose Hugh over his wife and son. Bad move. If Edward's type was manipulative, power-hungry schemers, Isabella's was rugged warriors with a taste for rebellion. Enter Roger Mortimer, a noble who loathed the Despensers as much as Isabella did. He had already led an uprising against them, got locked up in the Tower of London, and then made a legendary escape. He was everything Edward wasn't: bold, brash, and ready to take down their mutual enemies. It's perhaps no wonder Isabella was swept off her feet by him. The two had most likely met in England and had many things in common, including a mutual loathing of Hugh Despenser. Sometime in late 1325 or early 1326, Isabella and Mortimer became lovers, and any moral high ground she had when she had previously accused her sisters-in-law of adultery disappeared. But Isabella didn't care. She had bigger things to worry about, things like invading England. Wars don't fund themselves, so Isabella brokered a marriage deal between her son, also called Edward, and Philippa of Hainaut, daughter of a wealthy Dutch count.